Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's CHXD webinar, Unlocking the Mystery of Behavior Change Design. My name is Katherine Houghton, and I am the director of the center. And I'm here with Amy Bucher, Ph.D. She is our VP of Behavior Change Design, and she'll be talking you through how to become a behavior change designer. So before we get started, I just have a couple of slides. First off, just a couple of words about Mad Pow. So Mad Pow is a strategic design agency, and we leverage strategic design and the psychology of motivation to create innovative experiences and compelling digital solutions that are good for people and good for business. And as I mentioned, I run the Center for Health Experience Design, and that's a community of over 800 professionals and a range of organizations in the health space. We work with fledgling startups all the way to global corporations. So we focus really on collaboration. So our goal is to piece together multi-stakeholder initiatives that are open to and will benefit the greater community. So we really look to, for example, the UN Strategic Development Goals, things around poverty, climate change, social determinants of health to really attack and hopefully find solutions for those really big systemic changes. And we also offer memberships that are really a lightweight to strategically extend your team and bring in niche expertise. We offer access to subject matter experts, and this is one of our webinars that we're doing now. We have HXD coming up and workshops, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But if you want to learn more about the center in general, you can visit us at centerhxd.com. And as a reminder, for those of you who have not already registered, our annual Health Experience Design Conference is coming up in about 6 weeks, April 14th and 15th in Boston, Massachusetts. You can get more information, look at the speakers, look at what workshops we'll be having, our topics. That's all available at hxdconf.com. And we will actually be even hosting a workshop there. I'll tell you a little bit more. You've already signaled that you're interested in behavior change design, and we are having a workshop there on self-determination theory, which think you'll find interesting. More information will become later. So just a quick thing about GoToWebinar. So that's the platform we're obviously using for this, and we'll be presenting for about 45 minutes, and then we want to spend a good amount of time answering your questions. So just put them in the question box. You can see on the right-hand side what it looks like. I'll be monitoring those while Amy is speaking. And then at the end, we want to have a lively conversation and ask questions. And I'll also be sending out, the recording afterwards and a lot of links. But feel free to, if you have to leave early, email us, or we'll hopefully, or tweet at Amy if you have also questions. And her Twitter information is in here as well. So hope you enjoy this. I'm really looking forward to it. So over to you, Amy.
All right. Thanks a lot, Katherine. And hi, everybody. As Katherine mentioned, my name's Amy Bucher. I have a Ph.D. in psychology, and I am currently the VP of Behavior Change Design here at Mad Pow. You're actually going to hear a little bit more about my journey to getting to where I am today, just as an example of how one might become a behavior change designer. But before I get to that, I want to talk about what behavior change design even is and what does a behavior change designer do. Then, as I mentioned, I will share my story, but I'll also highlight a couple of other pathways that can lead people to get into this career area. And then I want to offer 3 suggestions for first steps that you can take to start to bring behavior change design into your work. I know that behavior change design is still a relatively new field. There aren't a lot of people who do it yet, and I'm really excited actually because I see us starting to coalesce as a community, find each other and make those connections, but it is still an ongoing process. So I wanted to offer these actionable pieces of tips that you can use right away. And then lastly, I'll recommend some resources for ongoing education, ways that you can either become familiar with behavior science if you aren't already, or if you are, really explore it in terms of that intersection between the science and the design, the application. So that's the flow of today. As Katherine mentioned, please do ask your questions in the question box, even as we go, but I'm going to try to leave some time at the end so that we can really get to some of those. So to start, what does a behavior change designer do? And I'll tell you, I spend a lot of time answering this question every time I introduce myself to someone who's outside of the field or who I don't encounter on a regular basis. I say what I do for a living and they get this look on their face and it's like, oh boy, now I have to explain the whole thing. So hopefully I'm getting pretty good at this. So behavior change designers, one of the things that I have noticed is there tends to be this knee-jerk reaction from people when I start to describe what I do. And I think it comes out of a lack of familiarity with what behavior science is, what design is, and how powerful the techniques we use are. But people will be like, oh no, so you're going to control me. You're going to do something that makes me behave a certain way. And that is not actually the case. We are, in fact, committed to being ethical in the way that we use behavior change techniques in concert with people. So it is definitely not about controlling people. It is instead about facilitating the ability of people to work toward goals by designing interventions that address barriers to target behaviors and promote conditions that are favorable to target behaviors. And I'll dive more deeply into how this process works and how it's done, but I just want to flash on a few things first. So goals. These goals are goals that people have. They're not my goals for them. They are goals that people have bought into that are important to them for one reason or another. And I consider that an important ethical tenet that I try to abide by in my work. So if I'm imposing my goals on someone else, I'm not doing my job correctly. Interventions is the catch-all term that we use for the things that we make. So they might be digital apps. That's often the case in my work. They could be clinical protocols that a therapist or a coach might use in a meeting with a person. They could be experiences where different types of services are brought together in order to shape somebody's experience with a brand or with a company. So it's really just this catch-all term for the things that we build. And then I will talk quite a bit about what I mean here around target behaviors, because that's a really important part of behavior change design. One of the things that is cool about behavior change design is we live in the space in between UX and behavior science. So I am trained as a behavior scientist. My background academically is very much in terms of being a scientist and using the scientific method and learning from previous research. But I work day to day in the user experience world, and I apply those science skills to the types of tasks and activities that other UX professionals also do. I've always thought this was a really exciting place to practice science. It was always appealing to me, even in grad school, the idea that the science I was learning could be brought to bear on people's experiences in ways that make them healthier, happier, more productive, whatever it is that they want to be. So I really love the idea of taking science and putting it into context where it can be immediately useful and experienced by people. Some of the things behavior change designers think about in their work, one of them is effective engagement. So in order for any intervention that we build to have an effect, people have to use it. This is aligned pretty well sometimes with the activities that you might see marketing teams do in organizations, but this is about raising awareness that interventions exist, creating circumstances under which people might be interested in interacting with them, and figuring out what that right level of interaction is. Because one thing that is true, I think, for most products, and certainly for behavior change design products, is that more does not always equal better. There's often a right dosage. People need this level of education or this level of coaching in order to get to goal. And more than that is just extra frosting on the cake. They're welcome to do it, but as people who are building this intervention, we don't need to aim for that. So it's really understanding how much is enough and then helping people to get there. Uptake, so this is really around like onboarding and making sure that people are continuing to use something. So it's really about understanding the context in which people live and what appeals to them. Behavior change is obviously at the heart of what a behavior change designer does, but this is about the behaviors that people are doing that ultimately lead to the goals that we have outlined that they are bought into and businesses are also bought into. And then finally, action or testing. We're a very results-oriented group of people, and so we're constantly researching and looking for evidence about whether the interventions we build are effective or not. And so that can take the form of outcomes testing, and I'll talk a little bit about what some of those types of research are. But it can also mean testing along the way. So as we are prototyping or we're doing early work, making sure that the things we're building are meeting the needs of our target users. And we use all kinds of different scientific tools and approaches to achieve that.
Can I just interrupt a second? We got somebody mentioned they can't hear. Okay, somebody else can hear. Thank you. Okay, over to you, Amy.
Thank you. So the behavior change design process, I have seen different terminology used for this process by different groups and organizations, and I'm not personally particularly married to a particular way of describing it. This is the terminology that we use here at Mad Pow, and I think it works pretty well. And although I have seen different terminology, it seems like there's generally agreement on what the steps are. This loosely follows a scientific method. So it starts with diagnosis or diagnosing, where you do your foundational research to understand what the problem area is. What is it you're trying to solve? What are the people who you're designing for experiencing? Who are they? What do they like? What do they care about? Once you get your arms around the problem space, you can move into the prescribed phase, and this is where you start to do some of your design activities. So you may be coming up with design principles or strategic objectives that you're going to pursue. You may be building requirements documents. You may be creating wireframes and sketches, but you're taking everything that you've learned in that diagnose phase, and now you're putting it into the preparation for an intervention. Next is implement, and this is where you're actually building whatever your intervention is and making it live. So in this particular phase, and I'll talk a little bit about the different skill sets that go into behavior change design, but I personally have very strong skill sets for the diagnose and prescribe phase, and less so for implement. So this is a phase where I personally would work very closely with visual and interaction designers, with app developers, and folks like that to bring an intervention to life, as opposed to doing that work directly myself. And my role in that phase is often making sure that there's a translation with fidelity from what we've produced in the prescribed phase. And then lastly is evaluate. And so I mentioned before that behavior change designers are very focused on outcomes and making sure that the things that we build actually work and have the intended effects on people's behavior and other outcomes that we may have outlined. I have these arrows here because evaluation comes at the end if you really want to break this down and make it simple and linear. But honestly, we're evaluating at every point throughout the process. So the diagnosis phase is very heavy on research. This is where we really go out in the world and talk directly to the people that we're designing for. We may do ethnographic or observational research and look at the context in which they live, but we are doing evaluation in that phase. And we may be looking at the tools that they're currently using for a behavior and seeing where those do or do not meet the mark. Prescribe, so this is where we're putting together some of those early prototypes, requirements documents, design principles, and again, this is an opportunity to go back to the people that we are designing for and make it so that we're more designing with them, getting their feedback and their input onto those early stage deliverables and ensuring that they are on track to meet the needs of that population. Ditto implement, and here you might also get into things like usability testing, which are really important because, as I mentioned, interventions don't work if people don't use them, and if it is not usable, it's not going to be used. So we really focus on, at every stage of the process, where can we pull in research to make sure that we are on the right track, that we are limiting the risk that we're taking, that we are ultimately, this is really also a cost containment measure, because if we're doing these checks at every step along the way, we're giving ourselves the best opportunity to course correct before we go out into market and potentially have to recalibrate. So one really key difference between behavior change design and other UX or design specialties that I see is that for us, behaviors come first. The first question I often ask a client prospect or a project team is, what are the behaviors you're trying to change? And it's really important for us to do our job successfully to know with a lot of specificity what those behaviors are. So I want to go through a quick little test here. And we have a poll that Catherine's going to put up in a moment, but there are 10 items here on this list, and there will only be 5 in the poll because that's the maximum number of response options. So you can just think through the bottom 5 on here, but I want you to think about which ones of the things on these lists are behaviors, because these are all things that are good and worthy outcomes that people may say they want to change through a behavior change design project. So can you push the poll? We have walking in the park, feeling confident, taking a pill, losing weight, wanting to make a change, being happy, reading a chapter a night, saving $100 a month, preparing for retirement, and practicing Spanish vocabulary. I'll give you a minute to fill that out, to select all that apply. So.
Okay, 42, 50% have voted. And we're at almost 75%, closing the poll momentarily. Yes, the poll only shows the first 5 because that's the limitation on this software. So out of those 5, what do you think? That's all we're asking for feedback for, the limitation of GoToWebinar. Okay, we're at 80%, so I am closing the poll. Sharing the results. All right, so it looks like taking a pill and walking in the park both win here at 77%. Losing weight, 49%, wanting to make a change, 32%, feeling confident, 27%. You guys did pretty good. So you're correct that walking in the park and taking a pill are behaviors. So are reading a chapter a night, saving $100 a month, and practicing Spanish vocabulary. These are all things that people do that are observable, they're measurable, they're very clearly action items. On the right here, you have ones that either are clearly not behaviors, or the last one I'll talk a little bit about. So feeling confident, losing weight, wanting to make a change, being happy, these are all common goals that we have with behavior change design projects. So, and you'll notice in my examples, a lot of our work here at Mad Pow and my work historically has been in health behavior change. So that tends to be the example set I most comfortably draw from. And we know, for example, that feeling confident, having a sense of self-efficacy is an important ingredient in getting somebody to do behaviors that ultimately lead to things like weight loss. So we do care about these things, but they are not in and of themselves behaviors because they are not actions that a person does that are clearly measurable. And so they are not typically direct targets of our design. I put preparing for retirement in red because that one is very broad, and there could be behaviors that fall underneath it, like saving $100 a month or opening an investment account. But the way that it's written as this sort of broad statement, it's really not a behavior. So our first step is really to sit down. If I work internally, it's with my project team. If I'm working with a client, it's with the client team. And really understand in a very granular level where we are defining these sorts of actions. What are the behaviors that we are targeting through the intervention that we're about to build together? And I will also add, so when I talked about the four steps, the diagnose, prescribe, implement, and evaluate, we don't always know when we start a project what these behaviors are. We may be using that diagnose phase to identify what the behaviors are. But regardless, before we go into building anything, we have to have that list all set. Interrupt with a question.
Mm-hmm.
So one person asked, why do you put behaviors first? I could see taking a pill as being a specific behavior that has to happen, but walking in the park might be one possible behavior that contributes towards a goal. In that case, why would you need to design for that specific behavior?
So it has to do with being able to be effective. So if a goal that walking in the park could support might be something like lowering stress, or it might be something like losing weight. But without being specific about what the mechanism is, we really don't have a lot of definition to build our intervention around. If I'm working with something like reducing stress or losing weight, there's still a lot of wiggle room within those to figure out what does this thing look like, how are we going to achieve that goal. So we're really trying to hone in on specific mechanisms of action so that we can design with precision.
It also seems like losing weight's an outcome, not a behavior.
Yes. In terms of selecting target behaviors, and actually that question was great because it highlights a little bit. So let's say you are looking at something like reducing stress and you generate a list of all the different behaviors that could lead to that outcome or support that outcome. Well, building an intervention, we have limitations that are both part of the project and part of what we're able to do as designers. We really probably can't build something effectively at a low enough budget, at a fast enough pace, et cetera, to get out into market if we don't narrow that world of possibilities. And so we do have to select a subset of target behaviors to design around. How do we do that? So we will use some more formal methods when we do this at Mad Pow, and again, taking into account what our clients' needs are. But just at a high level, one of the first things you want to look at is what behaviors are most related to the project's big KPIs or outcomes. So again, like if we're talking about something like losing weight, there's a lot of evidence out there that shows that changing diet is one of the biggest inputs into losing weight. It has more of an effect on weight loss than exercise does, where exercise, according to the literature, is a really powerful tool for weight maintenance or keeping weight off once it has been lost. So knowing that, if we have a client who's really concerned about making sure their population is losing weight, we might want to hone in on the nutrition aspect over the exercise aspect. That's the sort of consideration we would do. We would also wonder, do we have access to the people who do that behavior? So one project that I worked on about a year and a half ago had to do with improving safety on construction sites. And one of the limitations that we knew going into the project was that we had access to the construction workers. We could do things like provide them with training and tools, but we did not have access to the site managers. We couldn't go in and have new policies around how a construction site is set up and how it's operated. So right off the bat, we knew that even though we may be able to improve safety more if we were actually changing the construction site itself, that was not within our toolkit of potential. So it's a practical question to ask, who can I actually target, who might actually use this thing? And then related to that, can we influence them within the constraints of our toolkit? We run into this often as well with clients who work in highly regulated industries. They may have limitations around the types of things they're able to ask people to do. And so we want to inventory anything like that right up front so that we can use it to pare down that list of target behavior candidates. So not all behaviors are equal, and this is another thing that I find with behavior change design. I think that there is actually a spectrum of this in, like I said, this relatively new and just starting to coalesce field. But I don't think all behaviors need the firepower that a behavior change designer brings to the table. So I like to think about the complexity of the behaviors that we're trying to change. And in general, the more complex those behaviors are, the more firepower the behavior change designer is going to need to bring. So these are just some sample behaviors that I see a lot in my work, but clicking on a link is a relatively simple behavior. We have really good, reliable patterns that we can implement to increase the odds that people would click on a link. And those, they do come from a behavior change design background, but they're something that I think are pretty easy to understand even for non-experts and, can kind of be part of the toolkits that's generally available. Then you get something like learning to run and training for a race. So a newbie exerciser who's decided to pick up this new sport. There's some coaching needed there. It's definitely a little bit complex. You're talking about something that spans a pretty long period of time, but generally speaking, you're probably not talking about, for example, with medication adherence with side effects, now you're talking about some medical issues layered in, and that increases the level of complexity. The most complex projects that I personally have worked on have had to do with serious chronic illnesses, where people often may be comorbid. They may have more than one illness at the same time, and they may have to participate in pretty intense treatments. So they might be going and having infusions where they're hooked up to an IV to receive their medication on a regular basis. The more that you start to layer in those sorts of things, the more complex the behavior change is and the more firepower that is needed. So it's a consideration that we bring to the start of each project. And as we talk about bringing behavior change design into organizations that don't typically do it or haven't historically done it, I think it's easier to start to tackle some of the problems at the lower complexity levels, like how do we get people to click on more links? How do we get them to engage with this product a little bit more? Than to dive right into something like how do we help this person who is really seriously and significantly ill? Another early step that behavior change designers do is building an outcomes plan. And I know that people find this boring, but that also tells me that it's especially important. It takes a lot of discipline to do this early on, but it really provides a framework for everything that you do after this. And it makes sure that the intervention you build is the best it can possibly be. So what this basically is a straw man outcome story for if this product, if this intervention were successful, what would the metrics look like? And I like to organize them over a time frame from leading to lagging. And you can assign specific times here if that makes sense. But just at a high level, a leading indicator is something that you can measure right away. And so you want to have some kind of baseline on the population. You want to know what are people doing today, because that will tell you what you're changing. You want to, in order to measure a delta, you have to have a baseline. The other thing you can see right away is, are people using this intervention? What does the participation look like? So if you have something digital, you can measure how many people have enrolled in this, how many people are using it, how often are they logging in. And again, those are really important because they tell you, are people interacting with the intervention? The behavior changes is where it gets a little bit trickier. So if someone interacts with your intervention, what is it you'd like them to do? And you, again, want to be really specific about that. What's tricky about it is that if you're building something digital, for example, which is very often what we're working on, you often can't measure those behavior changes within the digital product itself. Big exception being activity trackers, where you are able to see if people are taking more steps or engaging in more types of exercise. So you want to define these things, but also know you may not be able to measure them directly within your project. And that means that there may be other types of research that you want to do. And then lastly is long-term outcomes. And I think of these as the outcomes that your clients or your customers are really looking for. So these are more the traditional business KPIs. Just to give you a little flavor of what this looks like, this is an example. So this is an example of what it might look like for somebody who is building a hypertension behavior change intervention. And so we're going to want to know off the bat, what is the standard health criteria of the people who are using this? What's the baseline for the population there? And then right from the bat, we can start to measure, are people registering for this app? Are they using it? Are they visiting it? We might also want to look at what specifically they're using within it, because that's going to give us some good information we can use later on to determine what, if anything, is effective in the intervention, where may we want to add more content, what might we want to eliminate from a future release. So all of this data can have multiple purposes, not just understanding outcomes, but helping us to build a better product. Now, the behavior changes, these are some of the behavior changes we would look for with somebody who needs to reduce their blood pressure. We want to make sure that they are seeing their doctor, and we might want to measure that they have made a doctor's appointment. And we could do this perhaps by surveying them and asking, have you made a doctor's appointment? What is the date of that doctor's appointment? We want to see if their prescription is filled. So did they go to the pharmacy and pick up the medication that their doctor prescribed for them? I have worked on projects in the past where we've collected this sort of data through third-party databases. You are able to purchase pharmacy data, and there are ways that you can connect it to your participant database. You have to use a third party to make sure de-identification is maintained, but there's ways to see that. You would want to see the number of days medication is taken per month, and again, there are ways to measure that. So medication possession ratio is one. And then minutes walked per week. If you do have an activity tracker, that would be an easy way to measure that. And then here, long-term outcomes. So you would measure these via EMR data or health claims data. These are all data sources that may be available depending on the clients you're working with, or the type of organization you are. But you actually want to see, are the biometrics of this person improving as a result of the behaviors that they're engaging in? Are they spending less money from using the emergency room or urgent care because now they are approaching their medical care planfully? Are they having fewer heart attacks and strokes? That's a really important one. You can also see that it will take much more time to measure those long-term outcomes because they take months, if not years, to manifest. It takes a really long time to know if somebody's actually having fewer heart attacks or strokes versus a comparison group. This is an example of what it looks like, and this exercise really is helpful. So first of all, it sets up your measurement plan for you. And secondly, it tells you a little bit about what you need to include in your intervention. So if I'm asking people to make doctor's appointments and to take their medication as prescribed, and I'm building an app that's coaching them around their health behavior changes, I should probably include something about doctor's appointments and medication adherence so that people understand what they're being asked and are actually getting prompts that will get them to take action. So I mentioned interventions is the catch-all term for the things that behavior change designers build, and they can affect what people do, how often they do it, how long they do it for, and when they do it. And an important takeaway from this is it's not necessarily introducing a new behavior. It may be changing the way people are engaging in a behavior. And that's particularly true, I think, in the health-related work that we do. So, everybody eats. And if we're asking anyone to do any sort of dietary intervention, that is a change. We're not introducing the behavior of eating for the first time. So it's really about understanding where they're coming from and helping to change that. A couple examples. So these are all commercially available apps that I consider to be interventions. So there's Nagbot. It's basically a reminder app that you can set up to nag you about behaviors that you choose, and you can calibrate the type of tone of voice it takes with you and how often. But you're basically asking it to help you change your behavior through these sorts of reminders and prompts. Wobot is a really lovely chatbot that helps people with low mood and subclinical mood disorders. And so I really recommend actually playing around with it. It's a lot of fun. It's really beautifully designed, but it does some very nice things through conversational AI to help change people's behaviors around their mood. Headspace, I think most people are familiar to, mindfulness meditation app. And then the one on the end here is Stash. I really wanted to include something that was explicitly not a health-related intervention. This is an investment app, but it's intended for people who are novice investors, don't really know what they're doing, and it helps them build up the habit of saving their money in investments and gives them coaching and guardrails to do that. So that is also an intervention. A couple things that are not really interventions. Untapped. I use this. I am a beer drinker. I like to track the different types of beers that I drink and rate them and find out what my friends are drinking, but it's not actually changing anything about my beer drinking behavior except the fact that I'm using the app. Spotify, another app that I absolutely love, but it's not, again, really intended to change a behavior beyond that I listen to more music and more podcasts. And then Facebook. So I wanted to point these out because these could actually be used within an intervention. They could be part of an intervention. So Facebook is a great example. There are different apps and chatbots that work within Facebook, but Facebook itself is not a behavior change tool. Similarly, Spotify, I can easily imagine it being incorporated into a meditation experience where it is being used to stream soothing sounds and music, but by itself, the way that it exists in the market without any other context, it is not an intervention. They do, however, hire behavior scientists and do really cool stuff with predictive algorithms. So not all behavior change designers work on building interventions. I wanted to make a quick note on terminology because I've been asked this several times recently, why behavior change design? And it gets to, so some people call themselves behavior designers or behavioral designers, and they will often work on similar sorts of projects to what I work on. I gravitate towards behavior change design for reasons that I've previewed a little bit, because we're really trying to change something people are doing rather than introduce it brand new. So especially in the health-related field, people are already doing some flavor of these behaviors, and we want to figure out what that flavor is and transform it to a different one. So I think change is a really important part of my job title, the description of what I do. That may not be true for everybody, and that's fine, but I just wanted to call it out. We work to understand behavior in context, and this is really important too. So really understanding that individuals are embedded within families, groups, societies. This is the Bronfenbrenner ecological model, if anybody's interested in that sort of thing. But we often will use it to guide the types of investigations that we do early on in our research, knowing that changing an individual's behavior may mean understanding something about the context. It may mean changing the context. And these are some of the behavior change theories and frameworks that I will say are used. I was going to say we use, but it's not actually true that we use all of these. I have a few that are really frequent flyers in my toolkit. So I use the COM-B model and the behavior change wheel a lot. I use self-determination theory of motivation a lot. We see behavioral economics tactics used a lot. But there's a much larger universe out there of behavior change theories and frameworks. And another distinguishing characteristic of a behavior change designer is that we do reach back into these theories and frameworks when we do our work. We want to be guided by the work that has come before and make sure that we are aligned with the science. Choosing a framework, is it applicable to your problem area? Has there been research in your problem area with that framework before? Those are kind of key indicators. If you use it, will it yield something useful? Not all frameworks are practically useful given the types of projects you might be working on. Some of them are much better suited, for example, to clinical conversations than to building something digital. And so even though they may be really great frameworks, they're not really great for my purpose. So it's really a little bit of a practical evaluation. And then I think there's also something to be said for doing what you're comfortable with. So as I mentioned, I use COM-B a lot. I use self-determination theory a lot. Those are theories that I know extremely well, and I'm confident in being able to use them a certain way, and so I rely on them pretty frequently. Literature review is a tool that behavior change designers use quite a lot. So this gets back again to that idea of wanting to build on the established science. We're not starting fresh. And I always like to think of this as a way of enhancing our chances of success. So we're going to learn from research that's been done before. And in terms of the literature review, it can be kind of hard to get some of this knowledge. So, Google Scholar is really great. There's a site called ResearchGate that helps you ask authors of peer-reviewed papers directly for copies of those papers. So if you get crafty, it gets easier to get access to some of this research, but it's an important way to make sure that you're learning from what's been done before. Sometimes you need additional subject matter expertise. I've worked in a lot of highly regulated industries, so I've done a lot of work with pharmaceuticals, I've done work with financial services, and oftentimes you really want to pull someone into your team who knows those industries well and can help you make sure that you're complying with anything that you need to comply with. I've mentioned complex medical issues, and typically working with a subject matter expert on that health condition is really helpful because they can help you more quickly understand what you need to be thinking about when you're talking to people who have that condition or designing a solution to assist them. And then sometimes you need deep knowledge about a specific population. So I see this more often now with work on vulnerable populations. If there's someone who's already deeply embedded in a community, it makes sense to leverage their knowledge and, again, have that as grounding for your own inquiry. Building the thing is next. So this on the right is an example that some members of the behavior change design team here at Mad Pow put together. But it's an example of how some of these concepts from behavior change, like commitment, self-monitoring of behavior, goal setting, these are all behavior change techniques. This is a way that they might come to life in a digital intervention. And part of our job is working with the teams who design these things to help them do just that, to bring them to life in a way that is true to the intention that really is the behavior change technique. Research, I already covered this. It happens all the time. Don't skip it. Oh, yeah, and I put lots of stars because I really mean it. And then lastly, at the end of a project, you're going to want to start to test for effectiveness and efficacy. And just really quickly again here, efficacy is generally, does something work in a clinically pure sense? So if you're doing a randomized control trial, you're really testing for efficacy, controlling for everything else, does this thing work? Most of the stuff that we work on does not get put out into a clinical sort of environment. And so we're really testing for effectiveness. And the messiness of people's lives and the way that they really use it, is this thing making a difference? So RCTs are fabulous, and we are seeing more of them being used in behavior change, for example, with digital therapeutics, but in reality, they may be too expensive, too difficult, not really realistic or worth it for most of the things we work on. So what instead we might do are quasi-experimental studies where we ask one group of people to use something and compare them to a similar group that wasn't using it. We might do real-world comparisons, so we let something just go out in the world and compare people who use it against people who didn't. We can do pre-post evaluations, so measuring what people are like before and after they use something that we've developed. Case studies, we do this a lot in business, so if we build something for a client, we want to tell their story and understand how it worked for them. That's not necessarily totally scientific, but it gives the next person a lot of information about what they could do to make a similar sort of approach work for their environment and their needs. And then surveys are another way that we can test. And there are advantages and disadvantages to self-report that I won't get into now, but they can be a really useful tool because they're scalable and cost-effective. So just remember that outcomes tell your story. I find that to be a really good guiding principle for figuring this bit out. Other roles behavior change designers play depending on the project. Sometimes we're subject matter experts. I support business development, so telling potential clients what behavior change design is and how it contributes. We can review and consult internally. So if somebody is working on something that isn't explicitly behavior change, but it has a component or could benefit from that, I might review things and give feedback. Providing continuing education as well as getting it for myself. And then marketing and thought leadership. So writing, sharing, those sorts of things so that others can also learn more about behavior change. So I do get asked a lot because I have a PhD, do you need a PhD to do this kind of thing? And absolutely not, firm no. In fact, I met a lot of resistance when I first went on the job market having the PhD, and I've even heard more recently from people that they are wary of PhDs sometimes. It's it's a long time to be training, and it's still an unconventional career path, and I think until more of us do it, there's a little bit of hesitation. But I do want to say I think anyone can be a behavior change designer, and I think behavior change designers can play all sorts of different roles. So I'm a strong researcher and strategist, but I have worked with behavior change designers who are service designers or content strategists who are more on the scientific and doing evaluation protocols and measuring outcomes, who are visual and interaction designers. I always think of it as bringing a certain lens to the work that you're doing, and in my head I see almost putting an overlay of color on top of the tasks that you might do in any of these other roles. So I think this is a really accessible higher order category for anybody who's working in the UX design or social sciences world. Just very quickly, because I do want to leave time for questions, how do you get here? And I just wanted to quickly push a poll here and see what best describes those of you in the audience. So we've got a couple options. One is going to be academic, which is the career path that I have followed, but then there's also, please push the poll.
Okay, everyone, we've got a poll here live. So if you could select all that apply, what best describes your background, social science, research, user experience, design, or other. And you can put it over in the question box what the other is. Oh, they're voting fast on this one.
Yeah.
Come on, 10 more % and I'll close down the poll. All right, closing it down.
All right.
And sharing the results. Wow.
Oh, wow, that's a pretty even split of things. So it looks like we've got a good mix of people with social science backgrounds, research backgrounds, UX design, and of course, people can select all that apply, so I'm assuming many of you are a combination. Katherine, can you share just one or two of the others from the question box?
Sure. We've got nursing leadership and marketing and patient experience, undergrad neuroscience and behavior science, public health research, science and project manager overseeing a behavior change project, MBA with design, thinking ed certification, nursing leadership. I mean, There's a whole ton of them here.
That's interesting with the nursing leadership. I actually, in my Ph.D. program, had a number of people who were studying nursing management who would take psych classes as electives. It seems like that's a nice potential overlap. So cool. Well, I'll talk about my own career path just in a little bit of detail. I do get asked this a lot, and I don't think it's that interesting, but people seem to. And then I'll quickly cover two others. So my career path is the academic one. So here's me at age 19 in my sophomore year dorm room, and I was studying psychology. I did not know what I was going to do with it, but it was fun. It was cool. I was required to declare a major, and so I picked one. And one of the things that I did in undergrad that ended up being really important for my long-term career was I got involved in research and working with faculty and grad students. And I don't know that my reasons for it were super sophisticated. I didn't realize the importance it would have, but looking back, that was a really key step in my career progression. And I do want to point out the cutting-edge technology here in the photo that includes a Motorola walkie-talkie that I used to use to talk to my boyfriend. So that makes me feel old when I look back at this picture. And then the amazing speakers on my ancient desktop. So from there, I went to grad school in psychology. I entered a Ph.D. program at the University of Michigan. I didn't really know still what I wanted to do. So this should say career growth still not established, but in the program, it was just kind of assumed that you were going to become a faculty member. Everybody was on the academia track, and so I assumed that I would be too. And I went really deep on research because that's what you do. And I got experience teaching because, again, that's what you do. And yet again, I used cutting-edge technology. So you can see here, this is my office in grad school and my personal computer. So we've got a zip drive, which I don't think even exists anymore, my Sony Ericsson phone, which was state-of-the-art, and then my kitty Pete, who helped me write my master's thesis, my dissertation. At some point, I had my first major career crisis, and this is, again, me in the office. I didn't label the ancient telephone that you can see there. I really loved psychology. I loved the work I was doing, but I didn't love the career path I saw unfolding before me. There were a lot of things about academia that made it feel like not the right fit for me, and one of them I previewed a little bit. It takes a long time to do an academic research study, write it up, get it published, have it out in the world, and then have somebody do something with it where it gets built into a product or a service or an experience that more people interact with. I really wanted to be involved more immediately with the people who might benefit from the type of psych research I was doing. And I did not know how the heck to do that. So I really did have quite a bit of panic and sort of like, what the heck am I going to do? So I had a great recalibration. I basically talked to pretty much everybody I could think of. Didn't get a ton of support from faculty, which isn't surprising in retrospect. Like, again, with the hindsight and some maturity, I realized that's the only career path they knew was academic, and so they weren't equipped to counsel me through something different. But I went to the university career offices, and just talked to all different types of people. And one of the things that I did at this time is I changed my research approach, and I started to go broad instead of deep. So I worked with 4 different labs over my last 2 years of grad school, learning different research methods, getting expertise in different topic areas. And ultimately, I think that was, again, a really helpful thing for my job search, because I went on the job market with a bigger toolkit than I would have otherwise. I also started to think about the skills I was building in a way that better matched job descriptions outside of academia. So my teaching experience, for example, if you're not an academic, you're probably not teaching, but you are communicating. You're translating complex concepts for audiences who may not have expertise. So how can I rethink the things I'm doing in grad school so that they are more one-to-one with the non-academic job market? And then I applied. I sent out so many applications to so many different companies, and it was really a bit of a crapshoot because I still didn't quite know what I was doing, but I had determined to do it. And I ended up getting a job with an agency called Big Communications that no longer exists. They were acquired, but I was doing research for them, and they specialized in doing training for pharmaceutical clients. And so I was there for a little under 2 years, and I realized a couple of important career things. One was that I love doing research. I love talking to people. I love getting insights from what they tell me. And I also love working in healthcare. I did not love working in pharmaceutical sales. It just wasn't for me. And I really hated long commutes. I had an hour-plus drive each way to the job, and I found that for me, that really was a quality of life issue. So with all that in mind, I found my next job, and that's where my real career began. So I worked for a startup called Health Media that had spun out of the University of Michigan, where I went to grad school. And it was 2 miles from my house, so I didn't have a long commute. But what was cool about it, it's a startup, so everybody did anything that needed doing. And in my first 6 or so months there, I think I had 4 different job titles. But over my time there, I worked as a content developer. I was a team lead for content and design. I was a product manager. I sat on the product team, but served as a liaison between behavior science and product. And then at some point, I became the associate director of behavior science. And one of the things I wanted to highlight here is that when you're thinking about becoming a behavior change designer, one of the pathways is to move laterally through an organization. So to do whatever it is that you do well, but also be picking up and honing that behavior science toolkit so that you may be able to fit other places as well. Rinse and repeat. From there, I kind of followed the same path. Johnson & Johnson acquired Health Media, and so I spent a number of years with J&J. They used our behavior science team almost as an internal consultancy. I loved working there. I spent about a year at CVS Health in the digital specialty pharmacy, where I learned a lot of really cool stuff about the complex operations that go into the pharmacy business and how to serve patients with really complex medical needs. And I've spent the last 4 years at Mad Pow. And one of the things that I've loved about my particular career is that every job offers new opportunities, new projects, new questions to ask. I'm going to skip that. Just in terms of academics, I'm a psychologist, but there's lots of different academic tracks that could lead to behavior change design. So social sciences and health sciences are the 2 I'm most familiar with, but I'm sure there are others. Career path number 2 is what I call the practitioner. And this is somebody whose training is as a UX professional. So they may be researchers, designers, strategists, but they develop an interest in behavior change probably while they're on the job, and then they begin to incorporate behavior change theories and lenses into practice. And this may be somebody who seeks out continuing education. So I know there's a number of behavior change type boot camps and certification courses now, and I'm meeting more and more people who are going and doing those while they're still working in their professional careers, and that's enabling them to make this transition. Some of the people I know who I respect the most as behavior change designers have come up through this practitioner path. And I think it's just it's a different way to get to the same blend. And then the third is the blend right off the bat, and this is pretty new. So there's a program at the University of Pennsylvania, a master's in behavior change and decision science, and I know I just screwed up the name of that, but it's an example, I think, of something we'll see more of in the years to come, where it's a focused program for people who want to apply behavior change in design and other professional contexts. To my knowledge, those programs didn't exist until recently, and I think it's really exciting that now they have become an option for people. And career path 4, your story. So this is still for you to write, but there's lots of different ways to do it, and I am confident that you will find it. Couple quick job search tips. So like I said, focus on your skills and contributions over job titles. What can you do and what roles does that fit under? Seek out people who are already doing the work and talk to them. Consider transitioning from within the company if you're in a company that is doing this sort of work or could benefit from it. But know that that can be a long journey too. I have known people who've gotten hired into one role with the hope or intention of quickly transferring, and that doesn't always work out. So you do have to prove your value there. And then when you download the slides, this is a hyperlink here, but Ingrid Pollan put together a really great Google spreadsheet of companies that have behavior change or behavior science within their structure. And so it's a global list. It's really robust. Her email address is at the top of it for people to add their contributions to, but I would suggest taking a look at that and seeing, if these are organizations that you might want to work for. I think it's a really useful tool. So just to wrap up, I have a couple of suggestions for how to practice behavior change design in your organization. So starting small and building, I have 3 suggested tactics, but just try 1 or 2 of these things, see how they work for you, and you can iterate from there. And remember that you can always call on experts to augment and support your efforts. A lot of the work that we do at Mad Pow for clients is actually rounding out their teams by providing some of this specialized knowledge like behavior change design. So that's always a possibility as well. The first tactic that you can try that is pretty accessible, I think, is a literature review. So diving into existing research to see what types of interventions work in your problem space. And I've listed out here some resources that you could use for that, because if you're not familiar with or you haven't done a lit review in a really long time, a lot of people haven't done them since undergrad, things may have changed. So these are some of the places where I start when I'm doing a lit review. But again, they really will help ground you in existing solution sets. 2 is the outcomes map. So take a crack at defining the goals of your project in really concrete, measurable terms across a timeline. And then once you've identified what it is you're trying to achieve, write down one thing your project actually needs to do to affect those behaviors. So just make sure that whatever it is you're building is well positioned to get to the outcomes that you're seeking. And then the third is a lens brainstorm. We do this a lot with clients, actually. It's extremely accessible, but choose a set of behavior change-based concepts to anchor your ideation process. So if you are holding some sort of structured brainstorm, this fits really nicely on top of that. So what you do is you describe each concept, and then you have your team go through their brainstorm with that concept in mind. And some of the candidates that we use a lot, I mentioned I use self-determination theory. So if you're familiar with that, I will use autonomy, competence, and relatedness as my lenses. COM-B, capability, opportunity, and motivation make really good lenses. And then if you ever do work with habits, cues, behaviors, rewards, again, just as an anchor for brainstorming. So wrap up here with a poll. Which behavior change activity of those, I guess if any, would you be most interested in trying in your work?
So you can just select one of the following. Is it a literature review, an outcomes map, a lens brainstorm, or other? And again, tell us in the questions. Okay, I'm just going to close the poll because we're running out of time. Let me share the results. Okay.
All right. I'm surprised it's outcomes map. Like I said, I sometimes get feedback. I think people are intimidated by the quant aspect of that, but I'm really pleased to see that it seems to have some appeal with this group. That's cool. So I want to make sure that we get to some questions. I do have some additional slides here, but they're mostly resources for your ongoing education. So when you download the handout, you don't need me to walk you through those. The one thing I do want to quickly point out is that I do have a book that is coming out next Tuesday, March 3rd. So it's called Engage, Designing for Behavior Change. It has some of this content that I've talked about today in it around how to become a behavior change designer and how to fit it into the work that you're doing. It's available through Rosenfeld Media, and if you order before the 3rd, it's 15% off and free shipping. So don't miss out. But with that, let's get to questions.
All right, and I already sent a message throughout you guys, but if you want to download that handout, you just have to go to the handout selection portion of this and just take it down. I'll also be sending out the recording and a link to the handouts after the fact as well. Okay, so I know we had a question about university programs. I know you mentioned University of Pennsylvania. Is there any other programs that would be, or online courses or anything like Coursera or edX? Have you seen anything?
Yeah, actually, Coursera sometimes has options that I think are really applicable, and I don't have a list of those courses to rattle off the top of my head, but yes, I actually took one on gamification through Coursera that I thought was really excellent. General Assembly is an organization that's in a lot of major cities in the U.S., and they will offer training courses and boot camps that can be very good. I don't know of any other university programs that are as specifically honed in on behavior science, but I do know that more and more design master's programs are starting to bring in behavior change and behavior science as part of their curricula. So I would also look there.
And I haven't looked at the specific agenda curriculum, that's the word. Dell School of Medicine has just launched the Design and Health master's degree program, so there might be something there. Again, I don't know, but it's a brand new program, and I'd be surprised if they didn't have anything about behavior change in there, just because it's a medical school. Okay. Outcomes map. Oh, okay, that's the answer. What is the breakdown of project categories you work with as at Mad Pow between health, financial, and social outcomes? Is it mostly health?
It is mostly health, but I've seen that shift in my 4 years here, where we are increasingly doing work in financial services, and I think now some of the things like climate action is an area that we're starting to specifically pursue because we really believe it's important. So probably like 60% health, 30% finance, and 10% other, but that's just me taking a bit of a stab in the dark. And I will say a lot of our finance work is really also health work. So for example, we might do work around benefit selection and health insurance, which to me is kind of the intersection of the two fields.
Perfect. So somebody says here, Beth says, the outcomes map looks pretty similar to a logic model. Do you ever use logic models in your work?
Yeah, we do, and you're right, they are related tools. So I basically stripped out some of the logic stuff in order to focus on the outcomes, but yes, we do. And we have built some logic models as well when we've had the opportunity to collect data from something that we've built. So I know Dustin DiTomaso has put together a medication adherence logic model in the past.
Mm-hmm. And Maria comments that Richard Ryan teaches a social determination theory class on Coursera. So go check that one out.
Yeah, and Rich Ryan, along with Ed Deci, those are the two founding fathers of self-determination theory, so you cannot do better than that. That's a great recommendation. Thank you.
Yes, we get a recording, everyone. I will be sending that out shortly, probably later today, early tomorrow morning. We'll include the slides and a bunch of links. Where can we hear Amy Bucher speak?
Well, I'll be at HIMSS on March 9th, talking about the psychology of trustworthy experiences.
You have a bunch of podcasts on madpow.com, don't you?
Yeah, and actually with the book coming out, I have recorded several podcasts. And the cool thing about it is they're actually all kind of different because every podcast has its own set of questions, its own perspective. So I don't know yet when exactly any of those will be coming out, but they're pretty good on madpow.com about announcing those things, and I'll tweet about them on my Twitter as well.
One last question is, have you ever worked in a developing country?
Not well, I did do one project when I worked for Johnson & Johnson where we were developing a really awesome program for people with type 2 diabetes in India. So I got to spend some time in India, traveling around the country, doing research in diabetes clinics and hospitals. I'm not sure if that would fit the bill because some of the places, even within India, there's a lot of variation in how developed it is. I would love to do that sort of work. I think it is so cool, and I always am really jealous when I talk to people who do that work.
It's a fun thing. Who's your favorite behavior scientist?
Who's my favorite behavior scientist? Not someone famous, but I was lucky when I was at J&J. My boss was Rich Bedrosian, who's a clinical psychologist. He's written a few books. He trained under Tim Beck, who, if you know about depression research, you know Beck, the Beck Depression Inventory. And I just learned so much from Rich. He really was a huge formative experience for me. So I'm going to say Rich Bedrosian, even though he's not famous.
She didn't ask famous, she asked for favorite.
All right.
If you want to go on to the last couple of slides, because we do have some things coming up. So I just want to let you guys know that we have another couple of more webinars coming up you might find interesting. On March 4th, we have one called How to Use Student Design Studios to Build Innovation Cultures in Your Organization. I will put links to all of these in the thank you email I'll be sending out with a recording. We also have one on March 11th called Health Language is Plain Language. And then as Amy will be at Him Speaking, if you also want to join us, we're having a networking event at Cafe 22 Tango on March 11th. I will send out the Eventbrite link for that, and you'll actually be able to meet her in person if you're in Orlando. But if you're not, but you're in Boston on March 25th, Amy and I are doing a book launch for her new book. So you can come and meet Amy, meet other people that are interested in behavior change design, hear Amy give a talk, have some cocktails, mingle with other behavior change, I would think wannabes, that's not the great word, but curious, behavior change curious people. And then last time is that we have a Health Experience Design Conference coming up on April 14th and 15th. And then we are having a workshop the morning of the 14th given by our SVP, Dustin D. Tommaso, on motivation technology, applying self-determination theory to digital health. So you can go to centerhxd.com events to see everything else. And like I said, it'll all be in the email I'll be sending out. So thank you so much for your time and attention. So glad you're here. I hope you found that as interesting as I did. And like I said, there's a lot of resources in the deck about books to read and articles to read. So there's plenty of learning you can do after the fact. And just want to tell you a little bit about Mad Pow. We're here to help you with your design and innovation goals. We do research and strategy. We do user experience design development, service design, intervention design, and design and evaluation, and design and innovation challenges. So any questions, reach out to me. Follow Amy at AmyBPhD on Twitter, and all that will be coming to you shortly. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.